Good evening. I appreciate the good attendance that we have here tonight. We started this study of is there a pattern by first asking and really answering that question, is there a pattern? And then we looked at the second lesson, we looked at the patterns of the Old Testament, how there are multiple patterns of the Old Testament. And then we looked at patterns in the New Testament, because we're not under the Old Testament, but simply to show that God has always had His people abide by the pattern that He established. And then we looked at the plan of salvation. There's a pattern for the erring Christian, or the erring Christian, and there's a pattern for the alien sinner. And we can't swap the patterns between the two. And so that's the direction that we're in with this lesson. Is there are people that swap the patterns between evangelism and benevolence in order to establish what they call biblical proof for what they're doing. And so we're looking at that tonight. Last 2 weeks, we looked at biblical pattern of church cooperation in evangelism. And now tonight, we will, I hope, go through and finish church evangelism or church cooperation in benevolence, rather. Church cooperation in benevolence. And we see from the outline, the question that I ask here is, what's the pattern for each church to raise its funds for benevolence? And 1 Corinthians 16 is obviously a pattern, is a passage where churches were raising funds for benevolence. And so I ask that question. And so we see each church raises its own funds. Raises its own funds by free will first day of the week offering of its own members. Churches didn't ever set up a sponsoring church in order for other churches to send them money, right? We don't find that in the New Testament. If we could, if somebody could, they would bring that out, truck that passage out, and we'll look at it. But each church raises its own funds by the free will offerings. And the patterns that I have, or the elements of these patterns that I've been using are not designed to be everything God said about evangelism or everything God said about benevolence. But I specifically chose these elements because these are elements that are violated in evangelism and in benevolence. The second point that we're going to look at is each church selects its own messengers. They didn't just hand the money over to the Apostle Paul when he came around. They selected their own messengers, and they would take their own gift. It was never designed as Paul's gift. They gave it to, in 1 Corinthians Acts chapter 5, when Ananias and Sapphira gave the money to the Lord, it became no longer theirs. It was the Lord's money, right? Well, how come it isn't Paul's money? When he came around and started collecting the money from churches on his third preaching trip to take to Jerusalem for the needy saints there. Well, it's because they didn't just hand the money over to Paul. They selected their own emissaries, their own messengers, and they would take their own funds. Those messengers would accompany the Apostle Paul in that journey. I think we sometimes have a misunderstanding that Paul went by himself. He and Timothy, or they just went by themselves. Well, they didn't. They had, as they would go and collect these funds from other churches, they would have these messengers from those churches bringing those funds with them. Paul wasn't the central bank or a sponsoring, he couldn't be a sponsoring church, but he wasn't a central bank that they gave their money to and then he just sent it or carried it there. They were all carried by each church selecting its own messengers. And each church sends to a church that is in need, and that's an important element. In the sponsoring church, is the sponsoring church in need? No, they want to establish a work that is greater than the local church's ability to perform. And so they create, if you want to say there's a need there, they create a need. That's not a biblical pattern that we see in the New Testament. Churches didn't create a pattern in order to siphon money from other churches in order to do a specific work. And so that's the third point. The fourth point is churches may send to another church or churches when the needy churches cannot care for its own members. Each church has, the College View Church here, has a unique responsibility for its own members here. Trying to think of another. Mount Pleasant, the church at Mount Pleasant, does not have any responsibility for us, the needy, if there are needy saints here. They have no responsibility for the needy saints here. This church does. So there is a unique relationship that this church sustains to its own members. Now, other churches, if this church is not able through its own funds to provide for those for whom God established that unique relationship, then as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Acts chapter 11, Romans 15, all those passages teach us that churches may send to other churches when there is a need present. And the purpose for sending from one congregation to another is that there may be equality. And we'll look at that. Not economic equality. He's not sending and saying, you have more money than they do, so you send your money to them. The equality that he's talking about, there's equality from what? From need, from famine, that they may eat, that they may be able to sustain life. And the sixth point is no church ever acted as a sponsoring church for other churches beyond its local need. There is never an example in the Scriptures for one church being a sponsoring church for all the churches in Asia Minor to send their money to Jerusalem, or all the churches in Corinth to send their money. There was no sponsoring church arrangement. I've forgotten how to, there we go. And so we'll look at the first point. The biblical pattern for church cooperation and benevolence is each church raised its own funds by its own first day of the week contribution. They didn't raise the funds for the work that they're doing by siphoning money from other churches in the area. Right? This is the way in which first century churches raised their own money by the first day of the week contribution, not by being a sponsoring church to siphon money from other churches. See that important point that is being made here in 1 Corinthians chapter 16? Look at 1 Corinthians 16. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I ordered the churches of Galatia, so do you. Whatever I'm telling you to do, I told the churches of Galatia. On the first day of every week, let each one of you put aside and save, so that he may prosper, that no collections be made when I come. And when I come, or when I arrive, whomever you shall approve, I shall send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. They're going to carry their gift. Each church has their own messengers. And if it's fitting for me to go along, I'll go with them. I'll go as well. See, the pattern that God set up, he never said, well, you know, there's a real need in Jerusalem. So I think it'd be a whole lot easier for this one church in Galatia to take care of the churches in Galatia. And then I can go to that one church in Galatia. And did Paul ever do that? No, he said, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, so do you. And so churches didn't work by a sponsoring church to send money to the needs of another church. Each church sent directly, and they had their own messengers that would take that money with them. And we'll see that in verses 3 and 4. Each selected its own messengers to carry its own funds. And that's an important point. Its own messengers, to carry its own funds. This is not a arrangement where churches pooled their resources together. This is, each church had its own funds, and they would send it through their own messengers. 1 Corinthians verses 3 and 4, 16, 3 and 4, when I arrive, whomsoever you approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. This is your gift. 2 Corinthians 8, verses 19 and 20. We've also sent along with him the brother whose fame in the things of the gospel has spread through all the churches. And not only this, but he also has been appointed by the churches, wherever they went, to travel with us in this gracious work, which is being administered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our readiness. And so Timothy was that messenger that would pick up the funds from other churches, or that would go to other churches, and he was entrusted with that work. So they didn't just hand the money over to the apostles. They selected their own messengers. And they didn't set up a sponsoring church to take care of the needs. I think the next slide, maybe it's the one after that. But ease was not the criteria that the apostles set up. It would have been a whole lot easier to set up a sponsoring church, frankly, I think, in different areas. It would be a whole lot easier for the Apostle Paul to have gone just to a few churches throughout his trip, just one or two, and collected all that money. But that's not the way it was set up. They would have their own messengers, they would have their own emissaries, and they would take them along with the Apostle Paul. Each church sent its contribution to the church in need, not to other churches that would collect the money and then send it with them. And the same passage, 1 Corinthians 16, 3 and 4, when I arrive, whomsoever you approve, I will send with letters to carry your gift. Acts 11, and now at that time some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine over all the world, and this took place in the reign of Claudius. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution to the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, carrying it in the charge of Barnabas and Saul. And so if we look at Acts chapter 11, and we've got kind of a time stamp on when this took place. This is about 33, 34, because he gives us the name of the person who was in charge at that time, the reign of Claudius. And so this was about 43 to 44 AD when Claudius was reigning. And so this is not the same event as 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and Romans chapter 15, where they were collecting money for the saints at Jerusalem. This was the saints at Judea. Some try to distort the scriptures and say, well, the church at Jerusalem was simply the sponsoring church for the churches of Judea. Well, they're 10 years too late, because 1 Corinthians 16 was about 52, 53 AD, not 42 or 43 or 44. So it was about a 10-year gap between what took place, 10 to 15-year gap between what took place in Romans chapter 15 and 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and Acts chapter 11. Is there any questions about any of this?
I just think maybe, you've already said this, but I just think maybe to emphasize, even the Apostle Paul didn't act as an overseer of this money. He was I like to call him a courier or a messenger. He was just accommodating the delivery of the funds that each church decided to send to the relief effort in Jerusalem. But he wasn't president or chief executive officer
Right.
of the Judean Relief Organization.
Right. Yeah, and oversight is really what we've been talking about throughout this whole thing. The church, the elders of the church at each local church, what was their oversight limited to? their own members, right? The church wherein they were serving as overseers or bishops. And so what would happen if in that church, if other churches, and this is actually the way the metropolitan system began, is other churches began saying, well, you know, those poor country churches, they're not as rich and powerful as the city churches, so we're just going to oversee them on their financial basis. And so the metropolitan system came in, where the churches of a metropolitan area, a large church of a metropolitan area, started overseeing the resources of country churches in that area. And out of that came the diocesan system of the Catholic Church that we see. And so, as Greg said, not even an apostle was violating or thought he could violate the independence, autonomy, and equality of other churches. And I think it was by design of the Holy Spirit as God gave the direction on how the funds were to all be done. This was not just a matter that was a matter of ease or a matter of Paul's own discretion. And so I have question 2. Into whose care was the money for each of these churches instructed? It was given to the Apostle Paul. Yeah, it was just handed. No. They selected their own messengers. They selected their own emissaries, their own, emissaries, I guess, is about the best way I can say it. And Paul said, if it's fitting, I'll go along too. But, I'm not taking oversight of this. You have the funds yourself, and you'll just be traveling with me, and I'll kind of provide the way as we go through, and all these churches and we collect all the funds from all these churches and have all these emissaries come and bring your gift. Acts chapter 11, verse 27 through 30, which is what we've already read. A church or churches may send to another church in need. 1 Corinthians 11 shows that. When Agabus came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and that there would be a great famine over all the world. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending in the charge of Paul and Silas, or Paul and Barnabas, to the elders. In 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4. Now concerning the collection of the saints, as I ordered the churches of Galatia, so do you on the first day of each week. Let each one of you set aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections are be made when I come. And whenever I arrive, whomsoever you appoint, with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. So they carried their gift to Jerusalem. Paul didn't just take over the oversight of all that. Romans 15, but now I'm going to Jerusalem serving the saints, Paul says, and for Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to set a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. Yes, they were pleased to do so, and they were indebted to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in their spiritual things, they are indebted to minister to them also in these material things. So it is perfectly scriptural, and God designed that a church or churches may send to another church when that church is in need for the area of benevolence. Is that has he done that in the area of evangelism? Is there a passage where we can quote and go to and say, yeah, Paul collected money for all these churches so that the church in Jerusalem could evangelize the world? No, we don't have that. But we do have, when there was a need, then the churches could send their relief to another church when there was a need for those funds. And point 5, the purpose of sending from one church to another was that there may be equality. And I think this is an overlooked and very important point. 2 Corinthians 8, 13 through 14. Now this is not for the ease of others and for your affliction, We're not trying to ease somebody else and afflict you by raising this contribution, by taking this contribution, but by way of equality. At this present time, your abundance being a supply for their need, there may be just come a time when you're going to need help yourself. And you're going to be the one who's going to be the recipients. And that's what he says in verse 14, the end of verse 14. So that their abundance may also become a supply for your want, for your need at some point in the future when that there may be equality. See that point? Not economic equality. He's not saying everybody should have the same amount after the first day of the week collection is taken up, but equality from want, equality from famine under these temporary measures. And there's absolutely no authority for a permanent human institution to do this, to care for a brotherhood need. And in the area of benevolence, the Church of Christ Disaster Relief Fund is a classic example. They are set up, they're in Tennessee, but I can't remember. Nashville? Okay. Nashville, Tennessee, where if there is a natural disaster, a flood, famine, a flood, a tornado, a hurricane, whatever, then they just collect millions of dollars, and they'll tell you how many millions of dollars they collect and send out. And they have clearly marked on the sides of their truck, Church of Christ Disaster Relief. And then they provide those resources to everybody, whether they're Christians or not, needy saints or not. They just provide it to everyone. But what if they just provided it to needy saints? Would that still be all right? No, that's the biblical pattern is a church may send to another church, or church may send to other churches that are in need, but they don't pool their resources in some human organization to do that. They sent to the need directly. And so, and I talked about the Herald of Truth and evangelism, that's done in evangelism. The Herald of Truth has been in existence since 1952 and going on 72 years. That's as permanent as an arrangement as you can find. Did God ever establish a permanent arrangement like that? An arrangement where churches could pool their resources and their funds so that one church may send out the gospel message throughout all the world? I thought each church had that same responsibility, that equal responsibility. One church that doesn't have, 5th and Highland Street, doesn't have a greater responsibility in evangelism than we do, right? So we have the same responsibility they do, so why should we send money to them and not be involved in the work of evangelism ourselves? And I use such as the West Coast School of Preaching, which is the same concept as the Herald of Truth. It's just where churches send their resources, send their funds to set up an evangelistic training program, a preacher training program. Yes?
I think it's really important the distinction that you made here, Wayne, that no church ever sent money to another church to accomplish a work of evangelism.
Right.
The New Testament pattern was a local church sends to a preacher, local, in some remote place, whatever. But there was always the communication or sharing was also always directly from the sending church to the receiving preacher. That's the pattern.
Yeah.
No church ever sent to another church in a matter of evangelism. In benevolence, a church or churches sent to a church where there was a need. So churches can send money to other churches or another church if there's a need in that church that you need. That church has a responsibility to fulfill the benevolent needs of its own members, and if they can't do it, then there's authority for another church or churches to send money to that church. But that church was a church in need. It wasn't a church in abundance. It wasn't a church that said, well, it wasn't the case where someone said, well, we don't have any particular need here, but we want to sponsor a relief effort to Ghana.
Yeah.
Or Zimbabwe. There's a bad famine in Zimbabwe. And so some church says, we want to address the famine need in Zimbabwe. Send money to us, and we'll oversee the distribution of the money to Christians in Zimbabwe. That's not the New Testament pattern. No church ever sent to another church unless that church had its own unique need in the matter of benevolence.
Right.
And that's what you've shown us here in this distinguishing of different patterns. There's different patterns there, and you can't blend them or
Can't flip them and switch between one pattern and the other. And was that a bell? Oh, okay. One important scared me. One important consideration that I want to make here is I'm not impugning the motives of these churches that are establishing these sponsoring churches. I mean, I think they're out of good motivation. They see a need that they want to be met, and they're trying to get that met, but they're simply not going by a biblical pattern in order to meet that need. Yes.
So the Church of Christ Disaster Relief Fund, nothing necessarily against that organization. If that were 100% fully funded by individual people, that would be.
As long as it didn't have Church of Christ Disaster Relief Fund, I would have no problem with that. I mean, individuals can do that. Churches cannot. God has. But see, we've got churches cannot create. The overriding principle is churches cannot create a human institution to do the work God designed the church to do. What that's saying, in effect, is, God, you're not smart enough and wise enough to be able to set up a organization to fulfill this need. So we're going to do that for you. We're going to set up a sponsoring church and Greg.
I think I would also stress, relative to what Eric said, you know, when we make these points about the importance of following the Bible pattern, then the accusation is sometimes that we're mean, stingy, uncaring, you know, we're glad people will starve to death.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely not true. And in reality, churches and Christians that follow the New Testament pattern, I think, are far more generous than churches that want to centralize.
Yeah.
But it's not a question of being mean or hard-hearted or uncaring. It is just the stressing of following the pattern and doing it the way the Bible said.
Right.
You know, I don't want to take up too much time, but one of the problems with churches supporting these centralized efforts is Christians get, I think, a mistaken sense of personal satisfaction. So let's say the church here decided that we're going to send $500 to the Church of Christ Disaster Relief Fund. And so the members are like, man, we've done a great thing.
We've done so much.
Look at what we have done.
Yeah.
Whereas if you dissected that as to how much each individual's money actually went to relieving needy people, it's tiny.
Yeah.
Maybe just maybe, $3 or $4 a person that actually went. But we're so self-satisfied
because we've done it. This is what the churches have done.
This is one of the dangers of institutionalism. When you institutionalize these efforts, I don't have to get my hands dirty. I don't have to spend my money, but I can still feel satisfied that I've accomplished something that I really haven't accomplished.
Yeah. And that's the point that I made to 10 institutional preachers in Fayetteville. When they said we've sent millions to this hurricane relief effort, and I said, well, how did you do that? Well, we gave $100 a month to the Church of Christ Disaster Relief Fund. And so I said, well, you actually then have not done anything. All you've done is supported a human organization who did the work. You didn't do the work, they did. And you're supporting that. Yes?
I have kind of a question going back to this original hearing that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We're sending this money to Jerusalem. decided, and they've gotten word back from a traveler or something that says this congregation needs help, right? That's how that works.
Say that again.
Okay, so the reason they're sending the money to begin with is word got to them that they needed it.
Yeah, yeah.
Travelers in the area.
Like Acts 11. Some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, Agabus, stood up and said, "We've got a need. You know, there's going to be a famine."
2 or 3 churches said, okay, we'll send our own emissary to them. What extent does that church have to oversee how those funds are spent once it gets to where it's going?
Yeah, their overseeing of that fund is through their emissary. And so they with the Apostle Paul, and as Acts 24, Paul says, "I'm going to Jerusalem to talk about assistance that's going to my own nation." And so they would do that. They would provide that.
So let's say you have 2 congregations and they pull their money together. They're going to the same church with it, and then they disagree on how the money is spent.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't pool their money together. They would.
They're not pulling it together, but they both go to the same church. Let's say
Yeah, they go
in here.
Jerusalem. They went to Jerusalem,
And then
right?
One of the guys says, I don't think they should be spending that money that way.
Uh-huh.
What happens then?
Well, this was a specific need.
Yeah, it was a
He
famine.
was saying all the money was going to that. They would have probably delivered it to the elders, and those elders who knew what the needs were would then
Then they're
take the
handling,
money.
they don't have any.
Right.
After they release the funds, they're.
Right, Acts chapter 11, 27 through 30, they handed it to the hands of the elders. So they handed it to the hands of the elders in Jerusalem. Now, the elders in Jerusalem are responsible now for, and why the elders in Jerusalem? They know the need. They know the people. That's God's design. They know who needs the money that's going from from person to person.
And once they received the money, then they became accountable for the oversight.
Right. Now, would a church at Corinth have the right to say, well, you're not you elders at Jerusalem, you're not spending that money wisely, so we're going to take our money back? Could they have done that?
I would say so because we do that now.
Then, how do we do that now?
I'm saying when we get word that some organization, or not organization, but some preacher that was supporting.
Well, yeah.
We find out, well, it didn't really go.
Yeah, but that's our oversight, or that's their oversight of this work. Right. That's their oversight of this work. But once the Corinthian church, once their members or their emissary went down and gave the money, then that oversight of that money was no longer their oversight at Corinth. It was now the oversight of the elders at Jerusalem. So that's the big issue: is who has the oversight? Is the overseer of the money the Galatian churches with their emissaries and the Corinthian churches and their emissaries, as they go down and say, you need to spend better this money? They would be overseeing the elders at Jerusalem then. And that's not God's design. They gave the money to the elders at Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has the oversight of those funds. Yes, sir.
You talked about, the fund or a distress fund, and then you said something about, a Church of Christ fund, how you didn't think that was necessarily right. I'm just a little confused when you kind of explain it again. If I was to start a widow's distress Church of Christ fund, I don't understand how that's wrong.
If you as an individual,
Me as an individual.
oh yeah, that's not what we're talking about though.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not. Yeah,
I think you were saying just don't attach the name Church of Christ to it if you're doing that.
yeah, right. If you did that as an individual and you said, okay, this is Church of Christ is doing this, that would make that wrong, because that would be putting in the minds of brethren who knew what was happening, this concept that this is some kind of institutional thing. This is the church doing this. It's not the church doing this. It's individuals that are doing. Now you could say Christians from, where are we? Colombia. Christians from Colombia are sending this money. That I would have no problem with that. But yeah, I wouldn't tie individual efforts to the Church of Christ and what it's doing. Yes.
I'm just, kind of spinning off of that, like if you think of Florida College, and then you think of Davidson, what's the difference? Well, one is supported by churches of Christ, the Lord's money, to educate people in secular things. The other is supported by individuals to do that. Is there anything wrong with the individuals doing that? No. And it doesn't say Florida, Church of Christ College or anything
Right,
like that.
right.
And then, but David Liston, although it doesn't say churches, we all know that it's sponsored by churches.
Yeah.
Just like when I was growing up and coming through Spring Hill, we used to have, there was an orphan's home right up here at Spring Hill off Main Street. And the sign said, supported by churches of Christ. And so
Right.
back in the late 50s, early 60s, it was a big thing in this area. A lot of things about, that. And, why wasn't there more non-institutional people adopting? That became a thing. If you're so good, why aren't you adopting these kids? Well, if you tried to adopt those kids, then you probably couldn't get the kids.
Yeah.
So, and not to say that people don't, but it became a very big topic. But, the position was that it's our individual responsibility to do some things, and it's the church's responsibility to do some things, and never the two should meet.
Yeah.
And that gets all jumbled up a lot of times when people think they have a better way to do it. We can do so much more if we do it this way.
Yeah, and that's the issue that I have with it, because God's design is never good enough. Yeah.
Back to this issue of assigning the Church of Christ's name to a work that
Yeah.
an individual person do, or an individual group of individual person. So, as an individual Christian, I can start a hot dog stand. I hope everybody would object if I called it the Church of Christ hot dog stand. No, so there is.
Yeah.
It is a matter of concern.
Yeah.
Let's keep those things distinct.
Right.
Let's don't
Keep our lines
Church
separate.
of Christ Relief Fund
Yeah.
in Nashville. Take that name Church of Christ off of it. Christian. Concerned Christians providing relief.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Individuals can support that. But when you put that name on it, and somebody, well, what's wrong with having the name on it? Well,
That-
because that
Ties the church to this concept. Yeah.
and of course, they're soliciting and accepting funds from
Right.
churches too.
Right.
That's the other part of that question.
Right. And so question 17, please read 1 Corinthians 16:3, Acts 11:27. Where did each church send the benevolent assistance for the needy church? To the needy church. They didn't send it to a church that didn't have a need, and then for them to set up a cooperative effort where all the money from churches all over the country could give to them, and they would become the sponsoring church for that work. And I said, please consider in question 18, please consider the following passages: Acts 11, 1 Corinthians 16, Romans 15, and didn't ask a question. Sorry about that. But consider them anyway. Consider them as we're looking at this concept of each church providing support to other Christians in other areas. Did anybody else have? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say, when you start attaching the Church of Christ to any of these like relief funds and all, there's two things you can get involved there, and that's corruption and competition.
Yeah.
And one's getting praised more than the other, and then you get into all kinds of conflict there, and you get into a competition and strivings, and that's parts of works of the flesh, by the way.
Yeah.
We can't be getting caught up in any of that.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to go out here and say give to the American Red Cross, by all means, give to it. But you can't start attaching the Church of Christ to any of that.
Yeah, and we had this happening in Africa where a couple of Christians got together and gave to a orphan's home, and then they said from whatever the Church of Christ they came from. I mean, that was wrong for them to do that. They should not have tied the church to their own work, what they were doing. But they didn't want to take glory on themselves. So they didn't name themselves, which was a good thing. But they could have just said, concerned Christians, Yeah, Eric. Okay. I think we've digested this. The fifth. Oh, we went back. The fifth point, we've already made. The sixth point, the last point on this. No church ever acted as a sponsoring church for other churches. That's an important consideration. And that's the whole point of this study. If you could find a sponsoring church in the New Testament, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd all say, okay, 1 Wayne 3 and 5 says, we set up a sponsoring church and we can do this work. But we don't have that. And so one church never acted as a dispersing or receiving church for other churches. We just don't find that. Each church sent their own messengers directly to the need. Because of an emergency need or a famine or whatever, there were temporary measures are sometimes necessary. And God understood that, and God made arrangements for that. To bring about equality among the brethren in these churches, 2 Corinthians 8, 13 and 14, God allowed this. God designed this, where one church could send to another church that was in need. There is no pooling of funds found in the New Testament anywhere. That's important. Churches did not pool their funds together. Paul didn't come to Corinth and say, we're pooling all our resources together from all these churches. I want you to be a part of this. You at Rome, we're pooling all the... That never happened. They each had their own missionary, their own emissaries, and they each sent their own contribution. Each church cooperated independently, autonomously, and equally. That's important. Independently. No matter what other churches were doing, even though Paul gave the same command to the churches at Galatia, the church at Corinth could have said, no, we don't have the funds to do that. We're not going to do that. They could have done that. Each church was independent of every other church. Each church was autonomous. They were self-governing. They determined to send the money themselves, and they were all equal. There was no church that was subservient to another church in the work that Paul was going around establishing or collecting money for the church at Jerusalem. No one church was just a sending church for other churches that would actually do the work. That would be a dependent relationship, an unequal relationship. The sending church it's not doing the work itself. It's only sending money to another church that is doing the work. And so there was never centralized control of other churches or of their work. And I think that or their work is an important distinction that we need to consider. And sponsoring churches, no. And I'm not saying sponsoring churches are taking complete oversight of other churches. But in that work, they are. They are taking oversight of other churches in that work, whatever that work is. If it's preaching the gospel, the herald of the truth, or if it's Church of Christ Disaster Relief Fund for benevolence, they are. Sponsoring churches violate the autonomy, independence, and equality of other churches. And we'll look at that in a minute. Sending churches are cooperating with sponsoring churches in an unscriptural way. See that? In an unscriptural way. The sending churches cooperate collectively, unequally, dependently, and with a loss of autonomy. The sponsoring church has all the oversight, and all the control of the funds of these many churches. So what happens is these sponsoring churches make all the decisions, provide all the methods of doing the work. And so what about the sending churches? They're just money-raising organizations for that sponsoring church. They are dependent upon the sponsoring church to do that work. That's not the way God designed churches in the New Testament. They weren't dependent churches, they were independent churches. They had their own oversight over their own work. New Testament churches followed biblical cooperation among churches. Did the bell ring this time? The first one, okay, I saw people. They cooperated independently, autonomously, and equally with every other church. Just as the churches of Galatia did, so did the church at Corinth. The purpose was that there might be equality, not centralized control of churches or of their funds. And next week, we got through what I wanted to get through. Next week, we're going to look at how this pattern is violated by one of the main proponents of the main architect, let me put it this way, the main architect of the institutional sponsoring church arrangement organizational structure. Thomas B. Warren is the one who even today is used by current writers. His material is used as they simply update his material. And we'll look at that, at his proofs, and see how he crosses the patterns to authorize things. Thank you for your cooperation and attention, and for your questions. Thank you.